Good morning, everyone. And as Emily said, it's great to have you here this morning. My name is Andy Lazur. I'm a water quality specialist with University of Maryland Extension. And it's great to partner up with Emily for this presentation today. So I'll be talking about landscaping septic systems. And it's a question that I get from homeowners. What can I do to help my system look a little bit better? And so I'm going to talk about a couple of things. Look at the different system types real quickly. And then what are some of the considerations of that landscape, if you will, but also what do you need to kind of understand about the system components and how they function before you begin to develop a landscape plan. And then I'll get into some of the strategies and practices. You know, it's important to note that when we think about landscaping septic systems, there's not a lot of science behind it as far as somebody trying different plants for different systems and things like that. There's a little bit of information, but a lot of it is kind of common sense. And as I go through this, you'll understand what species of plant, what characteristics of plants work well. For example, turf is the most common thing that's used over a septic drain field, for example. And it works really well because it takes up water, it takes up nutrients, and the actual maintenance of it, the regular cutting of it actually kind of fosters new growth, and that actually helps take up some of the excess water, because excess water on a drain field is not a good thing because it can kind of lead to overloading the system. So let me go through these things, and then we'll be glad to take any questions you have at the end, and you can type questions in the chat as we go along. So one of the key things in looking at a site is you have to think holistically. And what I mean by that is you have to look at the whole landscape, the slope of the property, the location of your drain field and your septic tank, and then also, do you have a repair area set aside? So for newer construction, that's a requirement that you set aside repair area. And what that basically means is that it's area that once your drain field no longer functions, because drain fields do have a lifespan, typically 25, 40 years. I've seen them last many more years, but I've also seen them fail, within 10 to 15 years or less. And a lot of that has to do with the type of soil and the use. And that's another topic in itself, is just, how to properly, maintain a septic system. But again, think about that repair area. You're not going to want to plant certain types of trees, for example, because then when it comes time to repair or replace your drain field, then you have to remove those trees. That's expensive. And then it also, breaks up the ground and all that, extra effort, that because the repair area should be what's called native soil. All right. That means it's undisturbed soil. So this is very important. And oftentimes, septic owners, they don't know where their system is. And so, where can you get that information? If you have an older home, for example, well, the local county health department, typically the environmental health office, may have records. And those records might include, the location, certainly the type, its size, for example, how long are those, drain field trenches, for example. So, consider that. And if you don't have that, if the county doesn't have that information, then hopefully you've had your tank pump, for example, and so you have a service provider that you've been working with. And so you learned over time, where the locations are of the different components. The newer systems, of course, have access ports to them. And so you might be seeing some, concrete or, green plastic sort of lids out there. And so you already have a pretty good idea of where your system is. But that's critical. You need to know where your system is before you can develop a landscape plan. So looking at the different system types, because again, that's very important to understand what type of system you have so that you could properly landscape it. Okay, so a conventional system is very straightforward. You have the wastewater coming out from the home, goes into a septic tank of some sort. You may have a newer BAT unit, for example, or advanced treatment unit. But what the septic tank does is it settles out the solids, separates the fats, oils, and greases, and then the more clarified water then goes out into the drain field. And then the drain field portion of your septic system is all about soil treatment, spreading that water out into a pre-designed volume or length of drain field trench. But basically what that is soil surface area for that wastewater to infiltrate into the soil and be treated, absorbed, etc. Okay. So drain fields, again, this is the soil treatment part. And you got different types. Here's the gravel, typical gravel trench, for example. This is a very small system with only 2 trenches. Then you have other types of drain field systems. This replaces the gravel. It's called chambers. There's other things that are used, prepackaged media around the black tubing, perforated tubing. We have a sand mound. We have drip dispersal, which is very shallow. And then some other innovative and alternative types of technologies dependent upon the site. So the septic system is site specific. The design of the system is based on your size of your home and the soils in your backyard. So your neighbor could have a different septic system because maybe they have either higher quality soil or poorer quality soil. So again, just note that. And here's a nice schematic of a sand mound system. So you think about that, you've got these access risers sticking up, right at the ground surface. So you can see that. Your pump tank, the same situation, but then you have this mound, okay? And this mound is specialized sand and gravel and such. So oftentimes people want to be able to landscape this big mound that they have, and particularly if it's in the front yard because the backyard soil is not adequate or something, then you've got this mound in your front yard and what can you do with it? So we'll talk more about that. Then a similar system with access risers could be a BAT unit, could be, it typically is a, advanced treatment unit. And then you have this shallow drip tubing, specialized drip tubing. And so this is a very shallow system, 6 to 12 inches. Okay. Whereas say a conventional drain system with gravel trenches could be several feet deep. Okay. So again, a drip dispersal system would have different types of landscaping, recommendations. And then you have the BAT units that we call them here in Maryland. They're called, advanced treatment units or aerobic treatment units in other states. But this is a typical concrete septic tank going in here. But this particular system has 3 access lids. Okay. So then, if we look at some of these features, so this is a BAT unit with the electrical supply on a post, essentially right there. So looking at your backyard on your porch, this is not necessarily a very attractive thing. So what can you do with that? Here's a situation where this because of the type of soil, they actually had to elevate the BAT unit, so you have both the access lids and a small mound. Then of course the sand mound system, and then in certain systems you have these inspection ports. Okay, that's for a service provider to be able to go out there and be able to examine, make sure that where the wastewater level is, etc. So what can you do with these things? So again, you have to think about, look at your system, look at the lay of the land, and determine, well, how can I, what can I do to make this a little bit more aesthetically pleasing, create some habitat, some pollinator habitat, for example. So these are some examples here, and you can see the 3 lids here. And this was just some recent planting where they planted some, flowers and maybe some shrubs around it. That's fine because these are, watertight lids. As long as these roots are not, too aggressive, that should be fine. These plants will get taller, and so you won't be able to see those lids, for example. Here's a very simple design of just, in this case, putting flower pots on top of the lids. Again, with some stone and things like that. So really, in a lot of ways, your creativity is comes into play here, and you can be creative. Here's another example where they've planted around a access lid and actually put a bird bath on top of the lid that's easily removable when it comes time to service. So again, that adds value, aesthetic value, a little habitat value, and again gets rid of the eyesore, if you will, of a riser access. And then here's a sand mound that's been landscaped. You can see different types of plants, different textures, colors, flowers. Again, wildlife habitat. And here's another picture that is kind of interesting. They added a lot of shallow-rooted plants. They put this gravel kind of mulch down on top, and then the stonework. So again, this is being kind of creative, and it works well. Lots of different ideas. And then here's something I got off on the web, and it mentioned it was a sand mound. You can actually see some riser there. But looking at this, I started to think, well, what about those trees? And those roots? How aggressive are those tree roots? Can't really tell what species that is, but it is pretty close to the drain field. Is that a problem? Okay, we need to consider that. And then here's another issue. What about the mulch? Is that the right type of mulch? Does it get thick? For example, oak mulch will over time compact, and it becomes very tight. And oftentimes you probably see that water kind of can run off of it. But is it allowing air? The thing about a drain field you need to think about is that the soil bacteria, the beneficial bacteria that do the bulk of the work, breaking down organics, things like that, that requires oxygen. And so if you put a thick mulch and you're blocking the oxygen flow into the soil, that's not good. That's going to decrease the effectiveness of your system, and then you end up making more of an environmental impact by having excessive mulch. So if we went back and we look at this gravel right here, gravel is pretty porous, allows water and air to infiltrate very readily compared to, say, some compacted soil or compacted mulch. And then here's another example online where they have a sand mound, but they put a retaining wall in and actually cut out part of the sand mound. Again, that would be not a desirable situation because you're reducing the designed treatment zone. And I certainly can understand why people want to have a little bit more access if the mound is close to the house, things like that. So, but again, you don't want to kind of infringe on the actual footprint of the mound. So there are a couple of publications out there on landscaping systems. This is one from Minnesota, and they actually had different type of landscape plans, if you will. So you can see again the backyard having this is the house, the backyard. Here's your septic system, probably the drain field. The tank is probably in between the house and the drain field somewhere. It's not labeled here, but again, how can you do that? This could be partial turf. Okay, this could be again different types of plantings. You can go in here and actually plant the entire top of your drain field, but again, the right species is really important there. And then again, going back to the idea of looking at the total lot, your total piece of property, and thinking about this repair area. How do I build that in? Is this the repair area on this particular site design, or is it over here? Again, you have to kind of build that in and think about that because, 20, 40 years, whatever, you're going to have to replace that drain field because over time, the soil is going to get kind of clogged up with biomat and organics, things like that. So again, there's the options as far as how you lay this out is pretty much open to your creativity and your preference for different types of plants. There are some, we'll talk about, some basic considerations. And of course, one of this is, plan ahead. Think about that repair area too in your landscape design. Again, here's another from the same publication talking about sand mound system. Where could you kind of place that in relation to the home? And how might that look from a landscape plan? Okay, you can see in this example, they actually have the driveway coming into the garage. The sand mound could be over here. Again, lots of different options. Of course, you already have a home, and it is what it is. You've got your system where it is. What can you do with this? So this is if you're maybe building on a new lot, or, for example, this is how you kind of creative that you can get. And so we'll get into some specifics as far as the features or the characteristics of plants and how they kind of meld or match with a septic system. One of the things I also want to mention when we look at the total landscape, one of the key septic system maintenance practices is to divert stormwater away from your system. And the reason for that is if you have a lot of water that drains down and sits on top of your drain field, you can hydraulically overload it. So your system is designed to handle a certain amount of water per day coming from your home. You don't want a lot of other water coming in. Of course, rainwater, it's going to sit there, but it's going to infiltrate out. What you don't want is excessive water coming from your drains or whatever the case may be. So you might have to put a berm in, you might have to put a swale or French drains around your system. Just really depends upon your site and the slope. Say if it's a flat area, okay, and you get heavy rains and the backyard just kind of is got a couple inches of water on it. Well, you could maybe, the way to do that would be to put a French drain system in there so that you're not overloading your drain field. Okay, so if you overload your drain field the soil gets overloaded and it can't take any additional water, what's going to happen? It won't infiltrate down, so it can go up or it can go back. And both of those situations you want to avoid as much as possible. So again, look at the stormwater diversion in your landscape design. And here's just some quick photos of a couple of things that are used: the swales, a berm that's being developed, and then it can be landscaped and things like that. So what I'd like to do now is talk about when we home in on the types of plants and things like that. But what are some of the other things that we need to think about landscape? Okay, certainly if you're going to plant over your drain field, even if it's turf, you do not want to till up the drain field. You can kind of maybe scratch it up a little bit to kind of loosen up that top inch or so of soil, but you don't want to go and do any deep sort of tilling, if you will. And then I already mentioned about diverting the stormwater. And again, if you've got a new system going in, say if you've had a new drain field put in, you want to put some cover on that as quickly as possible so that you reduce the erosion. You could plant it with turf and then come back later and plant it with some other species of plants to again to add that aesthetic and wildlife habitat value. And then the other thing you have to think about in this whole landscape design is you've got to have your system serviced regularly. Say you pump your tank every 3 to 5 years, or if it's a BAT unit, they need to have access to it either once or twice a year for its regular service. So you don't want to quote landscape the system so much that they can't actually get access to it to pump it and to service it and things like that. So, and then this is such a key thing: do not drive over the drain field. Okay, and the picture up here on the upper right shows a little small track loader that, again, it has a very light footprint compared to, say a backhoe or any other thing like that. So tracked vehicles are much better, excuse me, for landscaping, because they distribute the weight of that equipment over a wider area, and it doesn't compact the soil, because compacting the soil, basically negatively impacts its ability to take wastewater. And again, planting trees can be an issue. It's kind of been a long-standing rule of thumb never to plant trees near a drain field, in particular, or your tank, because the roots can be very invasive. If you think about it, all plants like what? Water and nutrients. And what does a septic system have? Plenty of both of those. So you really need to be aware of, certain trees have very aggressive roots. And I'll talk more about that. Another thing that can be used is root barriers. And these can, again, these are basically a plastic material that can be installed around the system, to your septic system, to prevent tree roots from, trying to seep in or grow into the moisture of your drain field. Excuse me. And then again, we want to consider low maintenance plants. And typically the rule of thumb is that you want roots that are relatively shallow, okay, and non-invasive. In other words, you don't want them, going too deep, and you don't want them, being so aggressive that they'll, get into, particularly a gravel trench is, there's a lot of opening, easy access for those roots to get into that pipe and clog it. So let's talk a little bit about the types of plants, okay? And again, there's not a lot of science behind this as far as, people have planted all these different species and done sampling and et cetera to see, are they causing any damage? How well do they do? This is mostly a lot of, observation, understanding the characteristics of plants, particularly the root growth and its penetration, also how do certain plants do in certain types of environments, for example, okay? And so obviously we know grass works well. And why does it work well? I already mentioned that, the root zone is not, super aggressive, but it's great in taking up water and nutrients. And so a lot of your, ornamental grasses, okay, some are mentioned here. There's others, but these are just some that have worked well. And this is coming from several sources of information, EPA and a couple of other organizations that have done, produced some fact sheets on this, for example. And so you even have some of the sedges and ground covers, okay, that can work well, because these tend to be relatively shallow rooted and they cover it well. So they're taking up, moisture. They're adding some again, some aesthetic value. And then, you have both sun and shade, depending upon where your drain field is located. You have some options there. And then there's wildflower, meadow mixes. This is some information from DNR, but these species, again, provide a lot of different types of value, both, from the aesthetic value, the leaf foliage, the texture, colors, the flowers, different seasons of flowers. So again, some of these are good for pollinator habitat, for example, but it can really add a lot of interest to the landscape. And then here's some wetter species that certainly can do well, relatively shallow rooted, and some are probably a little bit more better suited than others. But again, these could work well. Again, depending upon where the drain field is located. And then we'll talk a little bit about trees. So this upper list here these are species that tend to have very aggressive roots. Okay, and I've seen several of these species. For example, certain types of oaks that have actually followed the foundation where water is running off from the roof and having roots that kind of follow the perimeter of the house and take corners even because they're being able to tap into water. So those are examples of very aggressive roots that could both do damage to the system by clogging the water flow, wastewater flow. But I've even seen them be able to enter into an older tank, for example, and that's obviously could cause problems. But there are some species that are a little bit better suited. So you can see the cherries, crab apples, dogwoods. These tend to be shallower rooted species, but there's still a recommendation. And again, this is based on some observations that these species still their roots can move, and so again, trying to keep a 25-foot buffer. And I get this question all the time. Well, but I've got trees already. What can I do? Well, depending upon the type of system, again, a conventional gravel trench is probably, going to be several feet deep and would, the roots could, enter that because again, the gravel trench is, pretty much an open access because there's a lot of pore spaces in between that gravel. And then they can easily go through the gravel. And then there's that perforated, pipe that they can access. So again, there's some distance things. You might be able to get away with, or if you have a special tree that you just absolutely love and it's relatively close, you might consider a root barrier around your drain field, for example. So there are some options, but I have heard that even with root barriers, there's some species of trees that have been able to, either go up over it or typically under it and then, get into a system. So it's not 100%. So these are some other landscaping considerations. So if you have any turf, on your drain field, again, that regular mowing really increases a lot of the moisture uptake, which is good. And then, of course, what you don't want to do is if on your drain field is you don't want to mow when the soil is very wet because, interestingly enough, you're walking on it. If you're pushing a mower, your footprint does a lot of compaction, more so than a riding mower, for example. Also, avoid any sort of hard structure, or certainly not any sort of the weed barriers over your drain field, because again, that's blocking the water, blocking the oxygen flow. Okay. I get this question a lot, actually. Well, what about a vegetable garden? It's the only place I have in my lot, in my yard, to put a vegetable garden. It's right over the septic drain field, and that's not a good thing because again, dependent upon your system, the depth of your system, and the soil type, and the rain flow. Wastewater can wick up. And you don't want to expose people or your edible plants to wastewater, obviously for obvious reasons. And then if you are planting, wear gloves, use some common sense sanitation practices. Wash your hands because it's possible that you might get some bacteria from working over a drain field. And this is a really important point here, is that whatever you plant over your drain field, turf or pollinator flowers, whatever the case may be, avoid irrigating it heavily. Okay, obviously you got to water the plants to get them established, but you don't want to have a regular sprinkler system turning on and every other day or every third day watering your drain field. And that would not be a recommended practice. Hopefully you're getting enough rain that would keep the plants healthy. In a situation where there's a dry spell, you could do some very light watering, but you don't want to irrigate heavily. So with that, I'll stop there and take any questions that you have. There's a wealth of information out there. And again, as I said earlier, there's not a lot of research that has tested different plants. But again, what you want is plants that are relatively shallow rooted over the drain field, and you can get creative. As I said, going back to that list, and there's many more, a lot of options that you have. So it's gets into your creativity, gets into your preference for different types of species and habitat. So again, your options are pretty substantial. So I'll leave it at that and take any questions that you have.
Yeah, so you preempted the vegetable garden question, although we do have a follow-up on that. Of somebody has a vegetable garden, it's in raised beds, and they're about 8 feet away from the drain field. Is that something they should still be worried about with the uptake, or is that sufficient?
Yeah, that's a great question. And again, not a lot of science behind that as far as saying that, plants can draw wastewater from X feet away. So I don't have that information. But if you think about, 8 feet away, is it 8 feet away from the edge of the drain field, or is it 8 feet away from the middle of a drain field? So again, the drain field, if it's a conventional trench, they tend to be about 3 foot wide. So if you know where the edge of that drain field is, that drain field trench, 8 feet away, I would say you certainly have a pretty good buffer there, and the fact that you have raised beds reduces the risk. But it's hard to say absolutely. I would think again you do have some protection there. And then the other thing is it depends upon the soil type and also the water loading. In other words, in a heavy rain, for example, if you've got standing water on your drain field afterwards, that could be an issue because again, wastewater could be, does kind of by capillary action go up as well as it does go down. And so there could be a situation if you had standing water, and if your system's not percolating, effectively, you could get a little bit of wastewater, up closer to the surface. So again, there's no absolute, but it does sound like you have some protection there. The other thing that you might consider doing is putting in a plant barrier, if you will, around your bed. So, but again, think about the standing water. If that's an issue, then certainly I'd be glad to talk more offline with this individual. I mean, it's a great question. And I wish I had an accurate, no, you got to be 10 feet away. We just don't have that information. The only way to know that would be to do some testing. Great
All
question.
Right. Well, the next question is about Japanese stilt grass, which I know I do not have a septic system, but I certainly struggle with this one. And so this person has a sand mound with a significant slope that has erosion and weedy issues, including invasives like Japanese stilt grass. What plants or other solutions would you recommend? So it's an eroding sand mound with invasive weeds.
Well, so great question. With a sand mound, the erosion issue is real important because again, you're going in on the edge or the slope of a sand mound. You really want to try to minimize erosion as soon as possible because you don't want to compromise the treatment area. You don't want to have a washout where water is, wastewater is seeping out. Heavy rains can do that. I don't know how successful turf has been, for example, but that would be something, be a quicker remedy, if you will, to avoid, the rainy season erosion that can occur. Again, I would look at the list of plants that are on this presentation. You'll get a copy of this. So consider those options. What you want, though, is something that's going to be fast growing. And again, roots are going to help, prevent erosion. The other thing that I've seen this happen before is that people put sod down on top. And that was as a quick remedy to alleviate the erosion factor. And then they can go back in and, plant some other things. So typically, even a ground cover might be a good situation to use too. So there's you have lots of different options, but definitely do something to where you're minimizing that erosion as quickly as you can, even if it's, again, some sod, for example.
All right. So the next question, which I actually see some comments in the chat that are kind of in the same direction. So what do we do if, so it's a septic field in part shade or shade conditions, and so the grass is very thin, moss and violets are growing. Are there steps that should be taken to improve the coverage? And what about moss and perennials that die back in the winter?
Yeah,
are those sufficient?
Yeah, so that's an interesting and good question too. So yeah, so again, even some of the shade tolerant turf species, again, dependent upon the shade, level of shade, and moisture, may not do all that well. I mean, I've struggled with that in certain areas too. That you would think it would be a heavier, thicker, healthier stand, but it gets kind of patchy. And then what comes in is moss, for example, because it is shady. It's a little bit higher moisture, and they do go dormant during the winter, and that's fine. Think about this is if that's only part of your any plant during the winter time is not going to be actively growing per se, but they're still taking up water but to a lot lesser extent than in warmer months. But what that plant is providing is again, it's soil stabilization, particularly if it's a sloped drain field, whether it's a mound or you just have a sloped area in your yard. So that erosion prevention is really important. But you're not going to get a lot of, again, water uptake in the wintertime by plants. You get some species take up more water than others, but a lot of plants go relatively dormant. So I would think that again, look at the list, think about the species that do well. I mean, any type of landscaping, you really need to think about the location and look at it from the standpoint of how many hours of sun do you get. If it's heavy shade, then you really got to pick species that are that prefer heavy shade. So how many plants have I planted and put them in the wrong area? A lot. And so you really have to give this some careful thought. But also think about, if you haven't tried, even, certain fescues or other grasses that do well in the shade, that's turf generally grows fast. And if you need to prevent erosion quickly, that would be probably the thing to go with, or some of the ground covers.
So we have a couple of questions about meadows. Mm-hmm. So we have some people who have been trying to plant meadows over their drain fields, may not be having much success. So the first question is, if the drain field is currently not in use, so it's an old home that's being renovated, can the drain field be covered with plastic to kill the turf for the, oftentimes there are invasives or weeds that are growing in there in order to plant a wildflower meadow, or is that not recommended with the soil?
Interesting. I think that's the first time I've heard that question. So if the system is not in use, okay, so there's no water entering that system, then the drain field obviously is going to be dry, okay, with exception of any sort of rainfall. So covering it to knock back the vegetation shouldn't be a problem. Does this individual, are they planning on reusing the system, for example? But don't cover it, don't block the air flow over an operational system. That is an absolute, no-no, if you will, okay? But if a system is not being used for whatever, I mean, you're doing, home or site renovation, I wouldn't see where that would cause any particular issue, because again, the drain field is probably dry, the soil's not really needing oxygen to break down waste because you don't have any waste going into the system.
So sort of in that same vein, if there's a septic system in an old house, it's already been replaced once, so they're in their repair drain field, can the first drain field be used again after the repair drain field fails in 25 to 40 years, assuming everyone's maintaining everything?
Yeah, great question. I get that on occasion, and yes, in some cases that's true. You can go back because oftentimes what happens on a lot, you have the original drain field, and you have one repair area, and you don't have any options after that because you just don't have the space. So yes, I've heard that is possible. I've seen examples of it. A lot depends upon the soil type, though. Okay. Again, the beneficial bacteria in soil. I mean, soil is loaded with beneficial bacteria, and over time, and if you're talking about a 25 to 40 year time, what happens is that the organic material in that original drain field is going to continue to be broken down by bacteria, and then you have water infiltration, you have heat, you have freezing, you have what happens is that the soil, again, certain types of soil can be not back to its original native original type of structure and texture and other characteristics, but it certainly goes back in that type of direction. So it really depends upon the soil type that you have. But yes, it is possible to go back to an original drain field.
So a couple of other questions. Mm-hmm. So you've talked a lot about using turf as there's erosion, you need to get something on the drain field right away. What about other annual cover crops like clover?
Yeah, I would think that would work fine too. It's a shallow root. The strategy would be, trying to get something on there quick. So if it's a new drain field, for example, putting, turf is easy because it's fairly easy to seed. You can get sod if things are, erosion is really bad and you're in the rainy season, for example. But again, it grows quickly. Yeah, clover can work. I haven't necessarily seen that before, but yeah, I would think that would work fine. Again, right. This is the thing that we, there's a lot of different plant species, and so we're looking at those plant species characteristics. Shallow roots. How fast do they grow? Shade tolerance. All those things are really what you want to look at.
And we have a couple of questions about soil.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Yes. So here are, this person needs to improve her soil before planting and was planning on adding several inches of shredded tree mulch. And I know at one point in the presentation, you said that I think it was oak mulch tends to, really compact, make the drainage difficult. So are there better types of mulch? And then how do you know what type of mulch if you've done something good? Yeah,
I think that mulch, the typical types of mulch that you buy, particularly shredded mulch, I would avoid that, again, because it breaks down quickly and it can kind of be hard. And so if it gets sort of hard, just think about this. You want airflow, okay? So is there a mulch there that might stand up better? Pine bark, for example, might stand up better. But the thing about it, any mulch, is you want it very thin. So why do you add mulch? You add mulch to try to keep moisture in, right? Well, that's not necessarily what we're trying to do with a drain field. We want enough moisture to maintain the plant species that we have, but we don't want to block air flow into the drain field. So keep thinking about that. The drain field needs to breathe. I don't want to do anything that, interferes with that. Even a plant cover to some extent reduces the, can reduce the airflow depending upon the type of plant. But again, the plant roots, okay, are opening up that soil and allowing air in, and in some cases actually oxygen coming in, from the root, and certainly the root zone. So just think about breathing. Don't excessively use mulch over your drain field system.
So speaking of soil breathing, we have a question in the chat. What about clay soil? Many of us have it. Yeah,
absolutely. So think about clay soil and in comparison to, say, a sandy loam or sandy stilt loam, for example. Okay, the pore spaces in between the soil in a clay is very tight. In fact, just the nature of a clay soil. But also important in a site evaluation with soil is the structure. Okay, clay soils tend to be platy, layers on top of each other. And so it's very difficult for water to infiltrate and air to infiltrate into those layers. So, your system was designed in large part because of the soil qualities, and not only the clay and sand content, but in particularly the soil structure. Okay, so you have different types of structure. You have some structures that are kind of blocky, and they have just more air space in between, the soil grouping. And like I say, heavy clay is very difficult. And so if you have a clay soil and the texture is not, it's not blocky, it might be, some other things, or platy, you probably have a very large drain field to accommodate your house, because again, the lower quality of the soil and its ability to perk or infiltrate water, the larger your drain field has to be in order to treat that certain amount of volume per day. So clay soils, again, they can work. They're just, again, there's more characteristics to soil evaluation than just the clay content. Okay, so a lot, again, gets back to structure. So what does that mean as far as what should you do about it? Well, again, using plants can help kind of break that root zone up a little bit and allow, oxygen as well as water to infiltrate, but the plants are also taking up moisture. The big thing about a clay soil tends to be that it has a lower percolation rate, and you can get standing water over your drain field, which is, again, something that you want to avoid, because then you don't want to hydraulically overload your drain field. Good questions.
All right. Well, we have one about native shrubs.
Mm-hmm.
And are there any native shrubs that are okay closer to a conventional drain field? Would any be able to fit between trenches?
Yeah, good question. So if we typically, I'd have to go back and look at another list to look at the root zone of some of our shrubs. And I can't think of one off the top of my head, but I'll be glad to follow up with that. Most what's recommended, well, let me see if I go back in the slide. I don't know if it's in there or not. No, I was thinking right here. No, these are all, okay. No, there's no shrubs in here. I'd have to go back and look at another list. I can't think of any one off the top of my head. There may be. What I would want to look at is, you know, the basically the root growth, its penetration, and I'll be happy to follow up with that. However you want to do that, Emily, I could send it, you know, out to everybody. I'll send it to you, and you could forward it on. However you suggest. I'd have to give that one some thought and actually look at a larger list that we have to be able to, because I can't think of one off the top of my head.
And that is one thing that Andy and the extension service are working on, is a good list. So that way you'd be able to look up what are the, you know, what is the root profile of these different plants, and what would work on your very specific application. So couple more questions as we're rounding out to 11:30. So what happens if you have a really old house and you cannot find any information about the septic location or condition? They've already tried county records, and they've had only one occupant and minimal water use for decades, and they know where their farm irrigation well is, but they don't know where their drinking water well is. What's a starting point for that?
So, okay. So there, I heard sort of like two questions out of that. Where would the drinking water well location be, and where's the septic location? Okay. So a couple of things. This is a very common question. Okay. One of the things I'll note, though, is that if you've been in a house for a long time and you don't know where your system is, then that also suggests that you haven't had your tank pumped, okay, which can be problematic, okay, because what happens if you don't pump your tank over time is the solids can build up, and the fats, oils, and grease can build up enough to where you're sending out more of that type of material out into the drain field, which then can, you know, again, prematurely clog the system. And so that's one point. But what typically you can do, and is if you look at, depending upon the design of your house, if you have a crawl space, you're going to, you know, be able to look underneath there, or somebody could. You could certainly have a septic service provider come out, and they could get an idea based on where the waste pipe leaves the house, and that kind of point them in the direction. Sometimes it's, you know, in kind of a direct line. So the wastewater is coming out below the foundation, say, or your crawl space, and it kind of points in a direction. The tank may be, you know, straight out from that. A service provider can do probing with a, you know, specialized rod and kind of, you know, test it lots of different places to where they, you know, oh, I just hit a, you know, something hard. I hit maybe a concrete tank. Or they could look at and locate the drain field, for example, that way. Also, sometimes, of course, this would be obvious. Sometimes, particularly in the summer months, if the trenches are not too deep, then you might see, say, your grass growing better in lines, and that would be an indication that particular grass or vegetation is directly overhead the trenches. So I would recommend, you know, hiring a, you know, septic service provider to come out and to try to locate your system. You know, in some areas we have gravel trenches that are very deep, you know, 8-10 feet deep. And so they're very difficult to locate, but the septic tank should be easier to locate. And oftentimes that's, you know, several feet down. And if you don't have any sort of, you know, access risers, obviously then that means the tank is completely buried. And then what happens, you know, because if you need this, you know, recommended to have this tank pumped every 3 to 5 years, depending upon your use. You know, even if you have an older tank and the tank is still in good shape, you could have access risers installed, for example, so that service is a lot easier. Because, you know, if they have to dig up several feet to get down to your tank to pump it, that's a more expensive type of situation. So think about that. It's very challenging. I mean, I've seen sites where it took a long time to locate the system. So, but hire a qualified septic service provider to come out and try to find your system, because you do need to have it serviced, at least to have the tank pumped out. But it's also important for you, very important, as I mentioned earlier in the presentation, for you to know where that drain field is so that you could properly maintain it, or if you desire to landscape it or to do some sort of land practice that wouldn't interfere with your drain field. So that's very important to find the location. Great question.
And then what happens if, say, you're using your reserve drain field and you cannot go back to the original drain field?
Yeah, that's an unfortunate situation that we see. I would verify through a soil analysis that you can't go back to your drain field. Okay, that would be important. If you don't have that, if you don't have any other option, unfortunately, two things. There might be an alternative, an innovative and alternative idea, and you'd have to talk with the county or MDE, the regional specialists that they have to look at that. The only other option is a holding tank, and that's not treatment, that's just storage, and that adds significantly to the monthly cost, because you're probably looking at a monthly pumping, and so you're talking about several $100s in that. So that's an unfortunate situation, but very common, and increasingly more common, because we have systems that are old, or we have lots that are small, and it's a very unfortunate situation. I feel for you that you're in that situation, but I would verify that you could not go back to the original drain field, because again, if it's been decades, they may have to do some different design of a system. So I would look at that as an alternative, because a holding tank is not a good alternative. I mean, it's necessary in some cases, but it's again, it's more expensive than maintaining a regular septic system.
And it's always the good reminder to take care of your system, take care of your drain field, because nobody wants to have to go to a holding tank.
Yeah, absolutely. Prolonging the life of your drain field is like job number one, because that's, a tank or a BAT unit, can last decades. Okay, many decades. The drain field, again, you want to protect it. And so how do you protect it? Okay, well, again, that's another topic, but I'll just quickly mention a couple of things. I know we got about 2 minutes here. I'm happy to answer.
Well, and then I want to ask you about wood chips again.
Okay, all right. So, okay. Divert stormwater. Only flush toilet paper. Okay, no wipes, not excessive use of any sort of cleaners. Don't dump paint or things like that down your septic system. Okay, go recycle it. All right, avoid pouring grease down the drain. All right, think about your soil, and it's pretty compacted soil, and it's tight. If you're adding things there and there that kind of clog that soil, you're going to be you're asking for trouble. Okay, so those are the big things. And don't drive over your system. Don't build over your system, because you don't want to compact that soil. So those are the basic tips. There's a few others, but those are the key things. So wood chips, what do we got?
So what about wood chips as a component of shallow drip type effluent discharge?
So using wood chips as a mulch, or using wood chips as a biofilter?
I think this is wood chips as a biofilter.
Yeah, so wood chips have been used, and there is some documentation on that, and their effectiveness. Peat has been used, for example. So it's very possible to use a system like that. Again, it has to be designed system. You just don't, add wood chips and thinking you're, over your top of your drain field, or even dig up your drain field and add wood chips and think it's going to work. It has to be engineered or designed, in other words, essentially. But yeah, I mean, think what do wood chips do? Or, peat, for example, what does that do? Well, what it does is that it's moisture absorbing, for one thing, but it also helps to convert a lot of the nitrogen. And it also absorbs a lot of that nitrogen. So you're having a lower impact on on the amount of nitrogen that could potentially enter groundwater. But a BAT unit is a great option, because a BAT unit can remove 50, 60, 80%, close to 80% of the nitrogen. And not only that, but a BAT unit, if you look at the clarity of the water coming out of a BAT unit compared to a traditional septic tank, it's night and day, literally. I mean, you can see through the BAT discharge, the wastewater. I mean, it's very clear. And whereas, a typical septic tank, it's loaded with dissolved organics. It's going to be like, super dark coffee. And, so again, if you reduce the amount of organics going out to the drain field, you're going to help prolong the life of that drain field.
All right. And I know there are some questions still outstanding that are talking about, specific plant recommendations. Andy's email is on this final page. He and the extension are fantastic resources. So definitely encourage people to reach out. And then it looks like the final question is, do dosing, and this is actually a phrase I don't think I've yet encountered in my various work around septic systems. So do dosing siphons make better use of an existing leach field?
Dosing siphons. Is that what you said, Emily?
Dosing siphons.
I'm not sure I quite understand that. I mean, we do have systems that are dosing systems, okay, for example. So it's not like a continual wastewater flow. The design is to dose the drain field with a certain volume of wastewater for a certain time. And then that dosing cycle can occur, X number of times per day, but that's designed based on the soil quality, okay? A dosing siphon, I'm not, maybe that person, offer, just like you mentioned before, Emily, on the plant design. I wanted to say, I'll be happy to take any questions via email. That's great. I have, fortunately, through the extension network, people that have more understanding with different types of plants than I do. So I can always tap into other resources. And so, feel free to ask questions. If I don't know the answer, I will contact other people to try to get that information. And as far as the dosing siphon, the same question. If that person would be kind enough to send an email, I'll look into that, because I'm not exactly sure of that term.
Yeah, it looks like it is what you said. So it stores wastewater and then releases larger quantities rather than a continuous trickle. Right.
Yeah. So again, I mean, what I would need to know there, as far as making recommendations for landscaping, or even try to help better describe what that system's all about, I mean, I would need to know a little bit more specifics about your system, what type of drain field you have, and things like that. So feel free to reach out to me. I will follow through with all the questions that I get. And again, if I don't know the answer, the beauty of extension and working with our industry is there's a lot of expertise out there. And oftentimes I'll even ask industry people that do this for a living, as far as septic, to get a response, but I will follow through. And I really appreciate the questions, because it helps me to understand what people are dealing with and the types of things that they need. And so I value your questions, and we'll be glad to take any others that you have.
Yeah, and we just had the additional feedback that we had some invasive species on our list. So
well, yeah, you know, and thank you for that. I have noted that, and again, the most recent list that I have working with we used to have a native a plant specialist on staff, and she's left. And she pointed out a couple of things, but we've revised that list, and I don't believe this version. Well, you're probably right. There's a possibility that I had one or two in there, but I'll verify that. So thank you for that. If that person wants to send me a note or put it in the chat or whatever, let me know. But I'll verify that with this newer list that we have. So thank you for that feedback. I really value that. I know the first version of this I had probably 3-4 years ago had one or two invasive species that were published by other, you know, well, I don't think it was EPA. I think it was other universities that had published this. And so that's where that earlier list came from. So thank you for that feedback. That's great.
All right. Well, Andy, thank you so much for joining us this morning. Thank you to everyone who attended. We will be sending out the revised slides and list, and as well, we will be sharing this recording. And be sure to reach out. Your Maryland Extension is a fantastic resource on both septic systems, but also if you're trying to do non-septic native landscaping.
Absolutely.
The Watershed Stewards that you all run. It's a fantastic program. So thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you. Enjoyed visiting with everybody. Thank you, Emily.
All right. And stay cool, everybody.